Okay, for those that weren't here last week, um, I've been going through some of the history in preparation for being looking at the book of Revelation uh, sometime in the future. And I was going through all the kings of Judah and Israel and a little description of each of the kings. And we got down to, we did all the kings of Israel and most of the kings of Judah. And we were talking, I think we talked about Ahaz last week. And if you notice, he was, no, that Jotham was a good king. This guy was not so good. He walked in the ways of the worst kings of Israel. He was a king of Judah, but he was following after the Baal and Moloch worship, which means that, well, he actually did make his own children pass through the fire. I didn't describe it last week, and I don't know if you're all familiar, but Moloch was a god. It was a huge, they would make a huge statue, I guess, for lack of a better term, but it was of a kind of a monstrous creature that had his arms like this, and then his mouth open like just a gaping thing, and they would lay a child, they'd wrap the child in like swaddling, and they would lay him on the arms, and it would roll right down into the furnace, into the fire. And that was sacrificing their children to the god Moloch.
So you knew when you did that they were going to die?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It wasn't like walking through fire and getting out the other side?
No, you were killing your child to do that. And so that's how bad this guy was. And he practiced a lot of idolatry. I think we talked about him. So I'm just gonna I think you remember last week I said he was a wicked one, and he definitely was. So the next one, I don't think we talked to him about him, but if we did, wanted to talk a little bit more. But Hezekiah was one of the good kings. In fact, up until him, there wasn't anyone like him. He removed idolatry from the land and served God. You'd think of the children of Israel, of all the people in the world, it wouldn't have to be something, it would be a remarkable thing that he served God, but he did, and it was a remarkable thing. And the Assyrians by this time they had already taken the children of Israel, of the northern 10 tribes of Israel. They'd already taken them off into Assyrian captivity, but the Assyrians weren't done yet. They wanted the rest of, they wanted Judea too. And so they besieged, they sent Sennacherib to besiege Jerusalem, and he did, but that was the one place where in the middle of the night, God killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. And it happened, it was the reason that was discovered was because some lepers in Jerusalem were starving to death, and nobody would help them because they were lepers. And they figured, well, worst case scenario, if we go out there, is they'll just kill us, and then we'd be better off than we are now. And they went out there and went to the camp and found everybody dead. And so all their supplies were still there. So they were eating really good and everything. And then all of a sudden it dawned on them, yikes, what's God going to think of us if we're out here feasting and our fellow people are inside, even though these were ones that wouldn't help us, if they could have, God's going to judge us if we don't go in and let them know there's food out here and that the Assyrians are gone. What ones are left hiked out of there. And so they told everybody, and Jerusalem was delivered. The Assyrians left without taking Jerusalem. And Hezekiah was told by Isaiah was a prophet at this time, that he would die, but he prayed to God and God spared him. and he was given a sign. I think we talked about it last week. The sun went backwards 10 degrees. How that happened, only obviously it could be by a miracle. And but the one thing he did wrong was that he showed all the kingdom's valuables to visitors from Babylon. And we know what empire followed Assyria. It was Babylon. And you don't go around showing all your wealth to somebody that might be a potential enemy. It wasn't, this angered God, and he was told by Isaiah that there was the Babylonian captivity was on its way. It would be coming along before very long. So that was one of the first prophecies of the Babylonian captivity, the children of Judah, kingdom of Judah, being taken into captivity, just like their fellow Israelites from the northern 10 tribes were taken off into Assyria. So I think that's pretty much where we got to last week. The next, this king was extra good. The next king, oh yeah, before we go on, I was talking about the Assyrian general Sennacherib attacking Jerusalem, laying siege to Jerusalem, and then 185,000 men were killed and Jerusalem was spared. Sometime, I think it was in the 1800s, this prism was discovered in the ruins of Assyria, or of Nineveh, the ruins of Nineveh when they excavated there. I'm just going to read what it says here. This six-sided hexagonal clay prism, commonly known as the Taylor prism, or it's also called the Sennacherib prism, was discovered among the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient capital of the Assyrian Empire. It contains the annals of Sennacherib himself, the Assyrian king who had besieged Jerusalem in 701 BC. During the reign of Hezekiah, on the prism, Sennacherib boasts that he shut up Hezekiah the Judahite within Jerusalem, his own royal city, like a caged bird. This prism is among the three accounts discovered so far, which have been left by the Assyrian monarch of his campaign against Israel and Judah. So this is one. It's in the British Museum right now. Sue and I have both seen it. I made sure Sue saw it. She probably didn't care, but for me it was something special to see it. But there's a couple other things. These are direct quotes from Sennacherib prism or the Taylor prism, directly quoting what it says on one of these panels. As for Hezekiah the Jew, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong walled cities, as well as the small cities in their neighborhood, which were without number, by escalade and bringing up siege engines, himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. And then there's one more quote from this as well. As for Hezekiah the Judean, who did not submit to my yoke, I surrounded and conquered. Oh, I guess this one says the same thing.
There's more.
Yeah, it says, but 46 of his strong walled towns by leveling with battering rams and bringing up siege engines, 200,150 people I brought away from them and counted as spoil. And so he's talking about all the surrounding cities, some of the other cities, and he took a bunch of them away captive, but Jerusalem was spared. But you notice all it says is that Hezekiah, I had him like a caged bird shut up in Jerusalem. He doesn't say anything about why he didn't finish Jerusalem off or anything more. He just said, I had him caged like a bird, man. I'm really strong. But that's verification that the biblical story could be true. Doesn't specifically spell out, yeah, I lost 185,000 soldiers because they just all died right there. He doesn't say that, but what king would? They don't talk about their defeats. They talk about their conquests. anyway, this is, I'm going to show you some more archaeological evidence a little bit later. But anyway, after Hezekiah, the next king was Manasseh. And he followed in the, I guess, I'm just, when I had that red dot going on these last week, was that bothering anybody, or was it okay? All right, I'll do it again. It might help somebody. Anyway, he followed in the paths of the former nations of the promised land, like Moab, Ammon, Edom, all their idolatrous stuff. The reason they were kicked out of that area is because of all their idolatry. And so this guy goes back to following their gods. He reinstituted idolatry, including Baal worship. At this point, God decrees the end for Jerusalem. He's saying, okay, I have had enough. The end is coming. That's through Isaiah. Apparently, he persecuted many righteous to death, even his own people. He persecuted, killed them. If you want to read about it, 2 Kings 22:16. And then you'd have to go to some of the other writings of tradition to read more about it. But he was taken captive to Babylon by the king of Assyria. Now that's interesting. The king of Assyria took him to Babylon. And it was just at this point where the Babylonians were just about ready to take over the whole empire, have the empire themselves. They'd end up destroying Nineveh. And so you see from this that the Assyrians were trying to make friends with the Babylonians, but it didn't work out. Anyway, this Manasseh repented. I must have prayed to God over in Babylon, and he was allowed to return to Jerusalem. And there he instituted some reforms. So at least you can say that about the guy. And he was essentially extra bad, but his life was the reverse of everybody else's. Most of them start out good, but ended up being corrupt. This one started out corrupt, but kind of changed at the end. But while he was bad, he was really bad. Okay, the next king after that is Ammon. He did evil after his father, only this guy never repented. He followed in the same paths of all the idolatry and everything, only he never changed his mind. He followed all kinds of idolatry. He was assassinated by his own servants, whom the people then killed his servants for killing the king. And so we've already seen a whole bunch of murderous intrigue going on and everything. So that's no surprise to us. And this guy was the worst. He was just not a good king at all. Then after he was murdered by his own servants, Josiah came in. This guy, Hezekiah, was the best king so far. Josiah, perhaps even better than he was. He was the best king that Judah ever had. He did right all of his life. He began reforms at 16 years old. He was only 8 when he became king. And he was counseled by one of the prophets. And at 16 years old, 16-year-old kid starts doing reforms. He burnt the bones of the false prophets on their own altar. God had prophesied this would happen earlier to those false prophets. And now Josiah fulfills that prophecy. He began the repair of the temple when he was 26 years old. And what's the really interesting part here is the book of the law was found. We're talking the book of the law of Moses, the Pentateuch. It had been stuck in a corner in the temple someplace, and everybody forgot it. Everybody forgot it. Even the king of Israel the king of Judah did not even know it existed. But while they were doing repairs on the temple and refurbishing, somebody says, "What's this thing?" And so they brought it to the king. "Look at this, we just found it." And he started reading it, and he was scared to death. What in the world? Why haven't we been doing all this stuff all this time? And so he bound himself and the people to keep the law. And during his reign, we're told that God determines to destroy Judah because of Manasseh, but he's going to defer until after the death of Josiah, because Josiah was really good.
I take it that Josiah was not the royal line, he was not the son of Ammon.
Yeah. He still continues the dynasty, but he was just I don't know, I think he was Ammon's son. But that's why he took over at such a young age, is because his dad didn't die of natural causes. Anyway, he was king for 31 years, and even though the die was cast for the destruction of Jerusalem, God waited until after Josiah's death. Well, like this says, Josiah purged all the idolatry from Judah. And then Pharaoh Necho from down in Egypt decided to attack Assyria. Well, as you know, if you look on a map, Egypt's down here, Assyria's up here, Judah is right here. And so they marched right straight through Israel, and they met with the Assyrians right at Megiddo and had their battle there. And during that battle, Josiah decided to try to help. I can't remember whether it was Egypt or he sided with one or the other of them, and was mortally wounded, and he died after he got back home. They took him back home to Jerusalem, where he died. So anyway, that's Josiah. He was the best of all the kings, did right his whole life. Found, when that law was discovered, he said, "Lo, we got to keep this." But yeah.
Don't you think it's kind of interesting as you go through the line? Personalities of the kings show so clearly. Hezekiah was good, and then Manasseh terrible, and Ammon terrible. Then Josiah was good. So, everybody always says, well, he is his father's son or whatever. But, I think this shows that you have a choice to make what you're going to do.
Yeah.
And, Josiah and Hezekiah chose well, but very few did.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Nobody can claim victimhood based on how they were raised.
Right.
I mean, obviously it affects you, but you have your choice. And essentially, God has built within all of us a instinctive knowledge that, right and wrong, so to speak. And it's just whether you choose to take it or not. And like Sue says, this really does illustrate that really well. The next king is Jehoahaz. He after a good king, like he did evil in the sight of God. He was captured by Pharaoh Necho in Riblah, which is north of Damascus, up in Syria, and he was taken captive to Egypt, where he dies. And notice he reigned for only 3 months. I don't know if you can read this right here, but he only reigned for 3 months. So to get a reputation for doing evil in only 3 months, that makes him a bad one. And he was taken down to Egypt. All these kings like to take spoils, especially kings, so they could in front of all the people of their nation. They could have them bow down before them and stuff like that. I'm going to show you something in a little bit about that. It's really interesting. But anyway, that was Jehoahaz. After Jehoahaz is Jehoiakim. He also did evil in God's eyes. And in 605 BC, he became a servant of Nebuchadnezzar. At this time, some of the royal family and priests were deported to Babylon, including the prophet Daniel. So 605 or 606, depending on how you calculate it, is when the first wave of the people of Judah, the southern two tribes of Judah and Benjamin, they were taken into Babylonian captivity. 606, 605. And as you can see, it says all the royal family and the princes, including Daniel, all the cream of the crop people were taken captive in 606. And we're told about Jehoiakim. He served Nebuchadnezzar for 3 years, then rebelled. And he died just 3 months before Nebuchadnezzar came and deported most of Judah in 597 to quell the rebellion. So even though his family was up in Babylon, and maybe that's why he rebelled, I don't know, but he took it for 3 years, and then he says, no, I'm not going to take it. I'm going to rebel against Babylon. So in 597, Nebuchadnezzar came back and says, no, you're not rebelling against me. I'm taking you and a whole bunch of the next wave of people, the craftsmen, and the next wave after the royalty and the cream of the crop, they all were taken captive up to Babylon in 597. That was during the reign of Jehoiakim. And as you can see, he was bad. Next king of Judah was Jehoiachin, or he's also called Jeconiah. He did evil in God's eyes. And in 597, Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem. Jehoiachin surrenders himself and his family to Nebuchadnezzar. They're deported to Babylon with all the upper class people, including Ezekiel. And so now we've got Ezekiel and Daniel both in Babylon, which is where they write their prophecies, the book of Ezekiel, the book of Daniel. And Jehoiachin was up there in prison for 37 years. But after Nebuchadnezzar's death, he's released and treated like royalty in Babylon. And that's where he dies, is in Babylon. Anyway, he also was bad. Next king is the last one, Zedekiah. He wasn't king for long at all. I can't. I'm not going to try to fix this where you can see right in behind here, but he was just a matter of months. But he did evil in the sight of God. He wouldn't humble himself before Jeremiah. Jeremiah was trying to tell him, you might as well give it up because we're going to Babylon. He wouldn't humble himself. He rebelled against Babylon, tried to have some alliances with Egypt, and then because of this rebellion, Babylon lays siege to Jerusalem now. And after a year and a half, the walls are broken through. And this is 586 BC. The temple is burned, the walls of the city destroyed, along with most of the city. The survivors of the siege are taken captive to Babylon. Zedekiah's eyes are put out after watching the execution of his sons. He's taken to Babylon, where he dies. There's only rabble left in Jerusalem. I added a note here. Jeremiah remains in Jerusalem for a short while, and then his own people put his eyes out and haul him off to Babylon, where he dies. Jeremiah had been prophesying, look, people, God has said we're going to Babylon. You might as well give it up because we're going. Just give it up and just follow God. and they wouldn't, and they ended up putting his eyes out, carting him to Babylon, where he died there, and as an old man. Okay, so how uplifting has this been? Not so much. I guess I need to say he was bad. So now we've had Assyria taking all the Israelites captive. Now we got the Babylonians taking Judah captive. This is starting in 606 when the first wave were taken to Babylon. Now, for 70 years after 606, they're in captivity in Babylon. That means that puts it at 536 when they're released to go back home again. So Judah off to Assyria to Babylonian captivity. Now I want to read something for you. Psalm 137. It's got to be one of the saddest stories in the Bible. This was written after the children of Israel, or Judah had been taken into Babylonian captivity. It goes like this. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hung our harps upon the willows in the midst of it. For there, those who carried us away captive asked us for a song. And those who plundered us requested mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. If I do not remember you, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not exalt Jerusalem above my chief joy, remember, O Lord, against the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to its very foundations. O daughter of Babylon, who are to be destroyed, happy is the one who repays you as you have served us. Happy is the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. I just love the beginning of that. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Now they start crying to God. After they refuse, and God says, okay, just like I was done with Israel, I'm done with you guys. You're wiped out. Jerusalem was destroyed 586 BC because for such a long time they had refused to follow God, refused to have God as their God. Is it any surprise to you that in 70 AD, 650 years later, God did the same thing to Jerusalem for the exact same reason? They weren't following him in Jesus's time, and God said, that's enough. And so that's the part I want you to really get when we start studying the book of Revelation, because that's what it is about. All that trouble and all of the things you read about is God talking about it's the end for the nation of Israel. And Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. Jesus prophesied it 40 years before it happened in Matthew 24. So anyway, we'll get to that stuff as we get to it. And so where we are right now, Israel has gone into Assyrian captivity 150 years before Judah went. It was 722 BC that Israel went into captivity, and then Judah starting in 606. So it really wasn't even 150 years. It was more like 115 or something like that years. So now we have both of them in captivity, and this is what it looks like on the timeline. You have the time of the judges over here, and then Israel asks for a king. Then you have Saul, David, and Solomon, and then as soon as Solomon dies, Rehoboam makes a big mistake, and the kingdom is divided because of his poor choice of how to treat the people of his kingdom. And so 10 of the tribes decided to follow Jeroboam. I have these backwards. Rehoboam should be down here. Jeroboam should be up there. Jeroboam led Israel, but as you remember from looking at all this list of kings, every single one of the Israelite kings were bad. So they went off into captivity in 722. Some of the kings of Judah were good. And so God let it go on for a while longer, another 100 years, until 606. And he was done with them. And so the captivities began in 606. And then that lasted for 70 years. Okay, we have 10 minutes left. I want to talk about some more archaeological evidence, just like that Taylor prism that I showed you just a few minutes ago. There's other things that the archaeologists have discovered in Babylon and in Assyria. And one of those was the Babylonian Chronicle. I probably should have put it in its right time, but anyway, Babylonian Chronicle looks like this, and it's about the size of a pack of cigarettes, something like that. It's really small, but what it says is incredible. In the 7th year of Nebuchadnezzar, in the month Chislev, the king of Babylon assembled his army, and after he had invaded the land of Hatti, which is the Hittites in Turkey and Syria, he laid siege to the city of Judah, and that's Jerusalem. On the 2nd day of the month, which is March 16th to us, he conquered the city and took the king, which is Jeconiah, prisoner. He installed in his place another king, which is Zedekiah, of his own choice. And after he had received rich tribute, Zedekiah sent this rich tribute forth to Babylon. So that's what's written on this Babylonian Chronicle, totally verifying the biblical account of how things were going. And it is something that's in the British Museum. Sue and I have both have seen it with our own eyes, and so you can. I mean, this is just physical proof outside the Bible, totally outside the Bible, discovered by people that may or may not have cared about the Bible that much. They just cared about archaeology and finding out what had happened in Babylon, and they found this. Well, they also in Babylon found this. This was much later, after the Babylonians had been conquered by the Medo-Persians. Cyrus was a Persian king, and this is called the Cyrus cylinder, and it's the entire cylinder. You can't tell by looking at it, but it's round. If you look at it from the end, it's a cylinder, and if you roll it, you can just read everything that's on here. And one of the things that Cyrus says is it's written on this Cyrus cylinder is, I collected together all the people and returned them to their settlements. And the gods of the land of Sumer and Akkad, and which Nabonidus, who was a Babylonian king, to the fury of the Lord of the gods, had brought to Shuana, which is Shushan of the Bible, at the command of Marduk, which is a Babylonian god, the great Lord, I returned them unharmed to their cells in the sanctuaries that make them happy. Cells just meaning their dwelling place. May all the gods that I return to their sanctuary every day before Marduk and Nabu ask for a long life for me and mention my good deeds. And so Cyrus is saying, I let everybody go back. Well, guess who let the children of Israel, or the kingdom of Judah, at the end of the 70 years Babylonian captivity? Guess who it was that let them go back? It was Cyrus. And so again, outside the Bible, the same thing is said that the Bible says. This was buried for from from around 500 BC until the 1800s. So it was buried for more than 2,000 years, dug up and verifying the biblical account. Next one, well, this is the one that we already looked at, so I'm going to skip it. That's the Sennacherib's prism, or the Taylor prism. This one I really like. It's also in the British Museum. Cyrus cylinder is too, by the way. I don't know if I said that or not, but this is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser. It's a big granite obelisk. Well, it's not that big, actually. It probably stands about this tall, and it's probably about this big. It's square. If you looked at it from the top, you'd see a square, and it has 4 sides, and on each side there are panels. And on this one side, in the second panel, this one right here, in this panel, this is an enlargement of it. Oh, I got bigger pictures here in just a minute, but on that, well, let me just show you the bigger one. This is the panel. See this guy bowing down before this guy? Well, now I'm going to go back. In this panel, the guy bowing down before the other king. Second register from the top includes the earliest surviving picture of an Israelite. The biblical Jehu. I don't know if you remember king of Judah, Jehu, the king of Israel, brought or sent his tribute in around 841 BC. Ahab, the son of Omri, you remember those 2 names from going through that list. Ahab, the son of Omri, king of Israel, had lost his life in battle a few years previously, fighting against the king of Damascus at Ramoth Gilead. His second son, Joram, was succeeded by Jehu, a usurper. I don't know if you remember, Jehu was sent by God, actually, because God orchestrated it, and he killed both the king of Israel and the king of Judah. Anyway, he broke the alliances with Phoenicia and Judah, submitted to Assyria. The caption above the scene, written in Assyrian cuneiform, can be translated. Here's the direct quote from, that's written in one of these. I don't know whether it's this one or this one, but all this cuneiform writing says, "The tribute of Jehu, son of Omri, I received from him silver, gold, and a golden bowl, a golden vase with pointed bottom, golden tumblers, golden buckets, tin, a staff for the king, and spears." And so this is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser. So this king right here is Shalmaneser, the Assyrian king. This is Jehu, king of Judah, king of Israel, bowing down before Shalmaneser. Again, verifying the account, the biblical account of what happened there as well. So I just wanted to put those in there because they're so faith building to see. This was from back before 722. So now we're talking about another 100 years besides what the other ones were, as far as how long they were in the ground and then discovered and proving. I mean, this is specific. It names Jehu and has him bowing down. That I said before, like that one king, which one was it, Manasseh? Whichever one was taken down to Egypt. That's why they took him down, to do this, to bow, so that everybody could see, oh, this guy conquered this king, and now he's bowing down before it. They could see it with their own eyes and be very impressed with their king. And the king would get great adulations for doing that. I don't know if you can see it or not, but in this one, there's another guy bowing down. This is Jehu right here. In this one, there's another one bowing down, another king from someplace. And anyway, that's the way they did stuff. Well, we're a little bit, well, I guess I'll just look at this, get the finality of it. A couple things. This is the divided kingdom has come to an end for both Israel and the Assyrian captivity, and Babylon and Judah going off into Babylon captivity for 70 years. And then you notice the Assyrian captivity, they're just gone. A few people trickled back and became the Samaritans, but for the most part, they went to Assyrian captivity and never returned. So the Babylonian captivity, God said it's going to last 70 years, which it did. And in 536, the people were allowed to return from that captivity, and they began rebuilding the temple. And as we're going to see next week, a couple of the prophets, and a couple of the writers, Ezra and Nehemiah, are dealing with the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple, and other prophets like Zechariah, and I can't remember which other ones right now. Malachi were prophesying during this time here, and then you come to a period of silence. It's about 400 years of silence before Jesus arrives on the scene, and activity begins up again as far as the scriptures are concerned. So next week we're gonna look at the prophets a little bit and find out where they fit in each place as we go along. As far as the Revelation study that we're going to have, it's important to understand Daniel and Isaiah, especially what was going on in their life, what was going on in Israel during their lives, and you'll understand their prophecies much better having had the historical background. So that's next week. Anybody have any questions or okay?
The silence for 400 years, what transpired between that 400? This was the end of the captivity, but
Well,
were they just rebuilding and following God? Or?
Yeah, I'll tell you briefly, and then we're going to talk about it more a little bit later. But during this time, they complete rebuilding of the temple. You know, it gets completed, and then they go along. But it was just a succession of corrupt priests, the high priests. They would even kill each other. You know, one would kill another so he could become a high priest, and that was just going on, just like the kings that happened. Only now there's no kings. They come back from Babylonian captivity and say, no more idolatry for us. Thank you. We're done with that. But the intrigue kept on going with the priests, and they became more corrupt, and the Targums and the Talmud were written, and that's the priests trying to interpret the scriptures, and so they just get away from what the scriptures are really talking about, which is why Jesus said, "You've heard it said, but I say unto you." Jesus has said, we need to get back to God's truth. Anyway, they had just become more and more worldly, or whatever you want to call it, and less truly following God. They were made a pretense of it, but whatever they wanted to do, they figured out a way to justify stuff from the scriptures, and so that was going on. But then there was wars that started happening after Alexander the Great. He died at age 26 or 27, something like that. And before he died, though, he divided up his empire under four kings, and the Ptolemies and the Seleucids were the ones that had the area of Egypt and Palestine type of area, and characters like Antiochus Epiphanes and anyway, there was a lot of fighting and stuff going on in the century prior to Jesus. And we'll talk about some of that history more as we go, but things were happening. It just wasn't recorded. Okay, anything else? If not, thank you guys for bearing with me for this history stuff. Welcome, everyone, especially our visitors we have from Spokane. So grateful to have visitors stop by, and it really lifts our spirits. Glad that you could be here. Scripture reading for this morning is Matthew chapter 6 and verse 1. Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness before men, to be seen of them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. We're in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. And that verse is from the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. And the sermon begins with the Beatitudes. We've talked about these already. The essential idea from the Beatitudes is start with the heart. A good heart is a happy heart. Blessed or happy are those who do all those heart things that he talks about in the Beatitudes. And then after that, he talks about the responsibility of God's chosen people to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, to be a preserving factor and to make our lives taste better as God views us, and to light the way for other people who don't know God. That responsibility carries off to the church. After the children of Israel were no longer Israel anymore, the new Israel, Paul said, a Jew is not one who is born as outwardly a Jew, but one who is inwardly. And as Christians, we are all children of God. It makes us in that respect the chosen people of God. And then Jesus sets the stage for what he's going to say next by saying, do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets, but I say unto you. And in doing so, he asserts a new kind of authority, and he talks about the true and proper application of the old law, the old system of things. And he says, which we talked about last week, you have heard it said, actually for the last 2 lessons, you've heard it said, you shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery. Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. He said, you've heard it said, you shall not swear falsely. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But then he says at the end of each one of those is, but I say unto you. He is exerting his authority, and authority Gene talked about in the Lord's Supper. All the things. Jesus is God. He created the heavens and the earth. He has authority, inherent authority. We talked about that last week as well. And so then we continue on this week. Jesus gives us a warning, or gives the people he was talking to, which includes us as well. He gives a warning against ostentatiousness. I wrote it in a funny script and everything to make it look more ostentatious. You may not know what ostentatious means, but probably do. But just to help, I'm going to make a really ugly slide for you, which is on purpose, because ostentatiousness is not pretty to God. It means being showy. It means being theatrical, playing it up when you're doing things we'll talk about in a few moments. It means highfalutin. That's a term some of us know. It means boastful. You can see the peacock feathers in there. We all know what a peacock does. Strutting around with his tail all spread wide open so that everybody can see the pretty colors of the feathers. Pretentious, acting like somebody that they're not really. And lastly, flowery. There's a whole bunch of other synonyms, but I thought this is ugly enough as it is without adding a whole bunch more of these things. So Jesus is going to warn us against this ostentatiousness, this showiness. And he gives 3 examples. First example is giving alms, which means helping the poor. Second example is in our praying. Third example is in fasting. So the first example in giving alms, he has this to say. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by men. I tell you the truth, they have received their full reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And so you have to understand a little bit about the people of Jesus's day. We talked in class this morning about what things happen. We tried just briefly at the end, there was a question about what happened between the time of the end of the prophets and the beginning of the New Testament, that 400-year period, and we talked about them destroying more and more corrupt. One of the things that they did was they became very pretentious, very showy, and well, I'll just show the next slide real quick. This is a picture like one of the Jewish folks giving to the poor and saying something like, "Oh Lord, I thank you that I am more righteous than this poor sinner. You have given me a great heart for giving to the poor wretches. My friends know how generous I am. Accept this great gift and bless me accordingly." And that would be like something that they would say, just, oh, make it a showy thing. I tried so hard and I couldn't get myself to do it, but I tried really hard when we were doing the contribution. I wanted to just stand up and wave my check and make sure you all knew I was putting it in there. I just couldn't get myself to do it. I was thinking, what are they going to think for the next 10 minutes until I actually start preaching? So I apologize for not having enough guts to do it. Anyway, that's the way things went back then. But he says, but when you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. How do you do that? You can't do it, can you? First of all, your hand has no capability of knowing anything. What this is an idiom, and he's just saying, you know, if your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing, then certainly the guy next to you or anybody else is not going to know. Do it just to yourself. Let it be between you and God. And he says, giving should be in secret. Then your Father who sees what's done in secret will reward you. And so he says, your Father knows what you're doing. And that's the only one you really need to impress. Because if you do it to impress other people, that's the reward you get. Them saying, oh, what a giving person he is, or what a wonderful person that guy is. Look at all the good stuff he's doing. He makes us know for sure that he's doing all this stuff, and that's how great he is. If that's the reward you want, then go ahead and keep doing that. But if you want your reward to be from God, then do it in secret, because he sees you in secret, and it says he will reward you. You believe that? That God will reward you for doing good to other folks? Just keep that in mind. The only way he will do that. It's a wonderful thing. But if you're showy about it, and make sure everybody knows you've done a good thing, don't expect God to give you the reward. Other people's adulation is what is the reward you get for that. So anyway, today the example might be something like this. They're giving groceries to the poor, they're taking a selfie of him giving. Anyway, the next example is praying. Jesus continues and says, and when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen of men. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. Standing on the streets to be seen of men, that's the reward they're going to get. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. It's interesting. We're praying to the Father who is unseen. He can't be seen, but he sees us. And he, again, he will reward you for your prayers. He'll listen to what you're saying. If you're doing it to be showy, your prayers go as far as the people that hear you. They don't go any farther. And so we shouldn't be showy about our prayer. I don't think we have that much of a problem in this day and age, in the church at least, of people trying to be showy. I guess I have seen somebody leading an invocation for a Super Bowl or whatever. I guess they don't do that at the Super Bowl, but you know, some big event where some guy might get up and offer a big flowery prayer to God, trying to impress everybody. But in the church, I haven't seen it that much. But here's an example from the Bible in Luke chapter 18. The Pharisee, there was a Pharisee and a tax collector that both went up to the temple to pray. Here's what the Pharisee said. Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. He was doing it in a showy way to make sure everybody knew just how righteous he was. God says about him, he has received his reward. His prayer didn't get past the ceiling of the temple. Well, there's more that he says on prayer as he continues. Matthew 6, 7, and 8, he says, and when you pray, do not keep on babbling like the pagans, for they think that they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. This is one where we might have a little problem sometimes. People like to get pretty wordy in their prayers, and we might be doing that in our own prayers at home. The thing that he emphasized here is keep it concise. You're not praying for God. He already knows what you need. You're praying for yourself, because as you pray these things, it's impressing on your mind what things that you need, and makes you think about as you go through your daily life, okay, how can I accomplish these things with God's help? And so it's really for us that we have the prayers, but God does want to know that we trust him and that we'll ask him for things, but he knows what you want, what you need already. And so keep it concise. And he says this is how you should pray. Not like the flowery speech of the guy we just read about, but he says, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. I mean, how concise is that? You don't necessarily have to list everything about delivering us from the evil one, or all the temptations that we could be delivered from. You don't have to list them out there necessarily, unless there's a specific one that's really bothering you. And he just says, give us our food. You know, simple as that. And so he's concise. But in this, there's one point out of all these that he stresses. That's the one that's in verse 12, where Jesus says this: for if you forgive men when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. We need to let this soak in. First of all, he says, for if you forgive men when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. Stress the parts that are darker. God will forgive you. I don't know how many people walk through life not feeling forgiven, thinking, just bearing that guilt, even though they've asked for God's forgiveness. It says, if you forgive men, your heavenly Father will forgive you. You can feel forgiven when you ask for forgiveness. It is contingent, however, on this. But if you do not forgive men their sins, your Father will not forgive yours. Now, the first part of this is really good. God will forgive us. Second part, you have to think, uh-oh, is there anybody that I have something against that I really am holding a grudge? I haven't forgiven them for it. That can totally wipe out your prayers for forgiveness yourselves. If you want to be forgiven, you must be forgiving. So just think about that. Just let it soak in. Well, then the third example is fasting. Jesus says this, when you fast, do not look somber as the hypocrites do, for they disfigure their faces to show men they are fasting. I tell you the truth, they have received their reward in full. But when you fast, put oil on your head and wash your face, so that you will not be obvious to men that you are fasting, but only to your Father who is unseen, and your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And so these guys, just like they were ostentatious or real showy about their prayers, oh, thank God that I'm not like these other people and all this. When they would fast, they would let their hair get all messy. They wouldn't take a bath. They would just look really unkempt, and they would just go around, oh, what's the matter, Joe? Oh, I'm fasting today, and just make themselves, oh, well, yeah, great, hang in there, that's really righteous of you to fast like this. And so they would make a show even of fasting. And the purpose of fasting was not to make a show of things. It was to just forget about worldly things for a time, not even eating, and just dedicate thinking about God, meditating on Him. And so he says, if you do that, show that's your reward. When people see you and think, oh, how wonderful he is because he's such a faster. I don't know if that's a word or not, but that would be their reward. But if you want to be rewarded by God, just do it in secret. Notice he says, put oil on your head. They didn't have Brill cream back in those days. Didn't have mousse and all that other stuff. But we use that kind of stuff to make ourselves look nice. I don't have to use much of anything because I don't have much hair to do anything with. But bottom line is, make yourself look good. Wash your face. Make happy expressions as you go through your life, so that only your Father knows. When you do that, then your Father will reward you. There's a bonus thought that I want to talk about. And this, again, is one of those things that's good and not so good, just depending on where you fit in the picture. Notice he says, when your Father who sees what is done in secret. He says that in all three of the examples. Your Father sees what is done in secret. Well, that can be a really good thing. When you do good stuff, he sees that and will reward you for doing it. But when you do bad stuff, he also sees everything. So I'm telling you, put Post-it notes on your refrigerator and your bathroom mirrors, on your computer screen to remind you that God sees everything. Put it on the dashboard of your car when you're driving, so you'll be nice to the people that pull out in front of you or whatever. Give yourself reminders so you never forget that God sees what's happening in secret. He sees what no one else sees. You can't do anything without him knowing it. Get a tattoo. Maybe not one like this. I don't know if you can even see it or not, but the whole upper arm is tattooed with an all-seeing eye. I'm not saying you really should get a tattoo, but what I am saying is do everything you can to keep this idea in front of you. Write it on your bedroom ceiling. So as you go to sleep at night, the last thing you see is God sees all. God knows what's going on in my life. Well, in 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 12, it says, God sees and God hears. It says this, for the eye of the Lord, or the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayers. And so that's a really good thing, right? God's eyes are on the righteous, and his ears are open to our prayers. It's a wonderful thing. But it also is a two-sided coin. It says, but the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. God sees all, he hears all, and when it's evil, you go up against the face of God, not a place you want to go. And so I like the first part, the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, he hears our prayers. But the second part is true as well. We need to keep that in mind. Everything you do, everything you say, everything you think, whatever, everything that you do, it needs to be with the idea, this is between you and me, God. I know my heart. You know my heart. Nobody else does. I can fool people. I can impress people, but only you know what is really in my heart, and it's between you and me. That's an idea that I hope you will have. Maybe you already have this idea in your head. I hope you do. I hope if you don't, that you will start thinking this way. But we get to choose who rewards us. We all want rewards in this life. We all want good things to happen for us, and we get to choose who rewards us. Is it going to be men? Are you going to do things to impress people? Or is it going to be God? Who do you want to reward you? All the people can do is make you feel good for a little while. So what God can do, he can give you things that no people can give you on this earth, but he also can reward you with a home in heaven. That's something nobody can possibly do. And so obviously it's God that we want to reward us. The way to do it is just do it for God. And don't let your thoughts be about other people seeing what you're doing, and just let it be between you and God. That's the lesson. Jesus talks about three things: giving, praying, and fasting. These are all areas where people can be ostentatious. We just need to keep in mind everything that we do, let it be between you and God. Now, if you're here this morning and you haven't felt like you've been doing that, I encourage you to just change the way you're thinking. Like Paul says in Romans 12, be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. Change the way you think. If you're here and you haven't been baptized into Christ and you need to, you can do that this morning. If you need anything, need prayers from the congregation or anything like that, just come down while we sing the invitation song, and we'll do what we can to attend you to whatever you need. We're going to sing I Surrender All. I just hope that everybody can sing that with full truth. It's just you and me, God, and I'm surrendering my life to you.